White passenger accuses black man of stealing her seat. Flight attendants is unbelievable. A routine flight turns into a moment of confrontation when successful black CEO Michael Anderson encounters a shocking act of bias at 30,000 feet. What begins as a clash over a first-class seat spirals into a viral story, igniting conversations about prejudice, redemption, and the power of second chances. How will one moment of tension transform lives and inspire a movement for change? Let's stick around to find out. But before we dive into the story, comment below where you're watching from today. If you enjoy this tale, don't forget to subscribe. Michael Anderson adjusted his tie as he checked the time on his sleek smartwatch. He stood in the busy terminal of Atlanta International Airport, surrounded by the usual chaos of a Saturday morning. Travelers with oversized luggage rushed past him, children clutched stuffed animals, and announcements for delayed flights echoed over the intercom. Michael was calm, a picture of quiet confidence. At 42, he had built an impressive career as the CEO of a cutting-edge renewable energy company. A sharp suit, polished shoes, and a leather briefcase completed the image of success. But beneath the composed exterior, Michael was used to the subtle, and sometimes blatant, judgments that followed him as a black man in spaces where he was often the minority. Today's flight was a quick business trip to Chicago for a sustainability conference. Michael didn't travel light. He carried the weight of expectations, of being a trailblazer, and of proving that success wasn't confined to a single narrative. But none of that prepared him for the unexpected confrontation awaiting him on the plane. As the boarding call for first-class passengers rang out, Michael stepped forward with his ticket in hand. The crowd parted as he approached the gate, but the weight of subtle stares and second glances didn't escape him. He smiled politely at the attendant, who scanned his boarding pass and welcomed him aboard. Michael made his way down the jet bridge and into the plane, where the pristine first-class cabin gleamed. He found his seat, 2A, by the window, and was about to place his briefcase in the overhead compartment when he noticed a woman seated there. She was in her mid-50s, dressed in a floral blouse and beige slacks, her hair perfectly styled. She sat comfortably, flipping through an in-flight magazine, clearly settled in. Michael paused, double-checking his ticket to make sure he wasn't mistaken. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I believe this is my seat." The woman looked up, her friendly demeanor fading into suspicion. "Are you sure?" "I think you might be mistaken," she replied, her tone cool but firm. Michael raised an eyebrow, holding up his ticket. 2A. It's printed right here. Her eyes darted to the ticket and back to his face, her expression hardening. "That can't be right. This is first class," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper as if the words carried weight she didn't want the rest of the cabin to hear. Michael's patience remained intact, though he felt the familiar sting of judgment. "Yes, ma'am, this is first class. That's why I'm here. I'd appreciate it if you'd let me take my seat." The woman, Betty Stewart, straightened her posture, a defensive edge creeping into her voice. "I've been sitting here for 10 minutes. Are you sure you're not in the wrong section?" "Maybe." The flight attendant appeared just then, her smile faltering as she assessed the situation. "Is there an issue here?" Michael remained calm. "No issue. I just think there's been a mistake. This is my seat, but she's sitting in it." The attendant turned to Betty, her professional tone unwavering. "Can I see your boarding pass, please?" Betty hesitated, her face flushing slightly. She rummaged through her purse and produced the ticket. The attendant examined it, then gave a polite but firm nod. "Mrs. Stewart, your seat is 12B, back in economy." The words hung in the air for a moment. Betty blinked, clearly taken aback. "Oh, that must be. I must have read it wrong," she stammered. But her eyes flicked toward Michael, as if she still doubted his place in the cabin. "Would you like me to assist you with your things?" The attendant offered, her tone kind but unmistakably firm. "No, no, I can manage," Betty said hastily, gathering her belongings. She avoided looking at Michael as she stepped into the aisle, her movements stiff and hurried. A few passengers watched the exchange, some with curiosity, others with quiet disapproval. Michael took his seat, placing his briefcase in the compartment and settling in. Out of the corner of his eye, He caught Betty glancing back at him as she made her way toward economy. The brief exchange was over, but its weight lingered. As the plane taxied down the runway, Michael leaned back in his seat, staring out at the tarmac. He tried to shake off the encounter, but it gnawed at him. It wasn't the first time someone had questioned his presence in a space they didn't think he belonged, and it likely wouldn't be the last. The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane lifted into the air. Michael pulled out his laptop, intending to focus on his presentation for the conference. But his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman's expression, how quickly her friendliness had turned to suspicion, how she had tried to find reasons to justify what couldn't be justified. He shook his head and returned to his work. He had dealt with worse, he told himself. This was just another moment in a long line of battles he had fought with quiet resilience. Still, he couldn't help but wonder how many other people like him faced the same thing every day, without the confidence or the resources to brush it off. The rest of the flight was uneventful, but Michael's mind was already working. As the plane descended toward Chicago, he knew this wasn't just an incident to forget. It was a moment worth sharing, a story that might resonate with others and spark a conversation. What Michael didn't realize was that his choice to share this story would set off a chain of events far beyond what he could have anticipated. The plane landed smoothly in Chicago, the early morning sun casting a golden glow over the runway. Passengers began gathering their belongings, the usual shuffle of post-flight activity filling the cabin. Michael calmly waited in his seat, letting the crowd thin before standing to retrieve his briefcase. He couldn't help but notice the sidelong glances from a few passengers as they passed, some apologetic, others awkwardly avoiding eye contact. One man, a middle-aged executive type, paused near Michael's seat. "Hey," he said quietly, leaning in, "I saw what happened earlier. That was uncomfortable, to say the least. You handled it with a lot of class." Michael gave a polite nod. "Thanks. Unfortunately, it's not the first time." The man looked uneasy but sincere. "It's ridiculous that you even have to deal with that in this day and age. Anyway, I just wanted to say something." Michael appreciated the gesture, but it did little to soften the sting of the morning's encounter. "Thank you," he said simply, watching as the man moved toward the exit. Outside the terminal, Michael pulled out his phone as he waited for his car service. The incident with Betty replayed in his mind, the subtle but potent weight of her assumptions gnawing at him. It wasn't just about a seat. It was about the deeper layers of prejudice that still permeated society. The idea of sharing his experience crossed his mind. He wasn't one to seek attention, but maybe this could be a teachable moment. After a moment's hesitation, he opened his social media app and began typing. "This morning, I boarded my flight and found a woman sitting in my seat. When I pointed it out, her first assumption wasn't that she'd made a mistake, but that I couldn't possibly belong in first class. For the record, I'm Michael Anderson, CEO of a renewable energy company, and yes, I belong here." He paused, then added, "It's 2024. Why are we still dealing with this? Hashtag first class dreams, hashtag rethink bias." Michael hit post and slipped his phone into his pocket. He didn't expect much to come of it. Maybe a few comments, a handful of likes, but at least he'd said his piece. By the time Michael arrived at his hotel, his phone was buzzing incessantly. Curious, he unlocked it and saw dozens of notifications. His post had taken off. Comments and shares were flooding in, and the hashtag first class dreams was beginning to trend. Some comments were supportive. "Thank you for sharing this. These microaggressions happen every day, and it's time we talk about them. You handled this with such grace. I admire your strength." Others were angry. "This is unacceptable. People need to check their biases at the door." It's 2024, but it feels like the 1950s sometimes. But not all were positive. Some questioned his perspective or downplayed the incident. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Why make it about race? Not everything is a social justice issue. Still, the majority of responses were overwhelmingly supportive, and Michael's story quickly gained traction in online forums and media outlets. By the end of the day, he was receiving interview requests from news stations and invitations to speak on panels about racial bias and inclusion. Back in her suburban home, Betty Stewart stared at her phone in shock. A coworker had forwarded her Michael's viral post, along with a link to an article discussing the incident. As she scrolled through the comments, her stomach twisted into knots. People were tearing her apart, labeling her a racist and demanding accountability. Betty had never seen herself as prejudiced. She prided herself on being fair and open-minded, but the way she'd acted on that flight, her tone, her assumptions, painted a different picture. She couldn't deny the truth of Michael's account, and the public response was brutal. Things escalated quickly. By the next morning, her employer, a well-known corporate bank, had issued a statement condemning bias and announcing they were reviewing the situation. 2 days later, Betty was called into her manager's office and informed that her contract was being terminated. The company couldn't afford the negative press, and Betty's actions had crossed a line. She was devastated. Her life had been upended by a single moment, a moment she had thought was harmless at the time. Now, her reputation was in ruins, and she didn't know how to move forward. Meanwhile, Michael's post had sparked a larger conversation. On news programs and social media, people debated the implications of his experience. Was it an isolated incident or a reflection of deeper societal problems? Could individual moments of bias lead to systemic change if addressed publicly? Michael watched the discourse unfold with a mix of hope and concern. He hadn't intended to get anyone fired or to ignite a firestorm of controversy. He had simply wanted to shed light on an issue that needed addressing. But now, the story was out of his hands. A week later, Michael was sitting in his office when an email notification popped up. The subject line read, "An apology." It was from Betty. He opened the email, unsure of what to expect. It was short but heartfelt. "Dear Mr. Anderson, I owe you a sincere apology. My actions on that flight were inexcusable, and I've had a lot of time to reflect on what they say about me. Losing my job has been a wake-up call, but more importantly, your story has made me confront parts of myself I wasn't willing to see. I'm deeply sorry for the pain I caused you, and for contributing to the biases that harm so many. Thank you for sharing your experience. I hope one day I can make amends. Sincerely, Betty Stewart." Michael stared at the screen, processing her words. He appreciated the apology, but he knew it wasn't his forgiveness alone that mattered. Real change required action, not just remorse. He began typing a response, unsure where this path would lead, but hopeful it could lead somewhere better. The invitation came through an email from a prominent social justice organization, the kind that Michael had long admired from a distance. They had seen his viral post, along with the intense public response, and wanted him to speak at their upcoming summit on racial equity. The topic? Challenging bias in everyday spaces. Michael hesitated before accepting. Public speaking wasn't new to him. He'd done plenty of keynotes for industry conferences, but this was different. It wasn't about renewable energy or corporate growth. It was personal, vulnerable. Still, he couldn't ignore the opportunity to turn his experience into something meaningful. A week later, Michael stood backstage at the summit, his heart pounding as he glanced at the packed auditorium. Activists, academics, and business leaders filled the seats, their faces eager with anticipation. As his name was announced, he took a deep breath and stepped into the spotlight. "I'm Michael Anderson," he began, his voice steady but firm. "I'm a CEO, a father, and a proud black man. But last week, on a routine flight, I was reminded that no amount of success or professionalism can erase the biases people carry about someone who looks like me." He recounted the incident with Betty Stewart, his tone measured but powerful. This wasn't just about a seat on a plane. It was about the spaces we think people deserve to occupy and the silent assumptions that shape those judgments. The audience was silent, hanging on his every word. He shifted his focus, emphasizing the broader implications. These biases aren't unique to airlines. They're in boardrooms, classrooms, and neighborhoods. And it's not enough to call them out. We need to create pathways for change. Michael closed his speech with a vision. "That's why I'm announcing the creation of a new initiative, First Class Dreams. This fund will provide mentorship, scholarships, and resources to underprivileged youth, ensuring that the next generation has access to opportunities society too often denies them." The applause was thunderous. As Michael left the stage, he felt a surge of purpose unlike anything he'd experienced before. He wasn't just reacting to an injustice, he was building something that could make a real difference. Over the next few months, first-class dreams gained momentum. Donations poured in from corporations and individuals inspired by Michael's story. Schools and community organizations reached out, eager to partner with the initiative. Michael's team worked tirelessly to identify students who could benefit from mentorship programs and scholarships. Among the applicants was a young boy named Jacob Stewart. Michael didn't recognize the name at first, but as he reviewed Jacob's application, the details caught his attention. Jacob was 17, a talented artist with dreams of studying graphic design. His essay described growing up with limited resources, his single mother working multiple jobs to support him. Then Michael saw the name of Jacob's mother, Betty Stewart. He sat back, the weight of realization sinking in. The same woman who had dismissed him on the plane was now reaching out, albeit indirectly, for help. He thought about her apology email and the sincerity in her words. This was a twist he hadn't expected, but it was also an opportunity to practice the values he preached. Michael reached out to Betty, inviting her and Jacob to the First Class Dreams office for a formal meeting. When they arrived, Betty looked nervous, her hands clutching her purse tightly. Jacob, unaware of the history between his mother and Michael, was brimming with excitement. "Thank you for meeting us," Betty said, her voice quieter than Michael remembered. "Of course," Michael replied, offering a warm smile to Jacob. "Your application impressed us, Jacob. We think you'd be a great fit for our mentorship program." Jacob's face lit up. "Really? Thank you so much, Mr. Anderson. This means everything to me." As Jacob stepped away to admire a display of the program's previous projects, Michael turned to Betty. Her eyes were filled with a mix of gratitude and lingering guilt. "I didn't realize," she began, her voice faltering. "I didn't know you were behind this. When Jacob applied, I thought about that day on the plane, about how wrong I was. And now, here you are, helping my son." Michael nodded, his tone gentle. "Betty, I've always believed in second chances. Your apology meant a lot, but this isn't about me. It's about Jacob and his future. If we let our past define what's possible, no one wins." Tears welled in Betty's eyes as she whispered, "Thank you. I'll never forget this." Betty's experience with First Class Dreams didn't end with Jacob's acceptance into the program. Inspired by Michael's compassion, she began volunteering with the initiative, helping to organize workshops and fundraisers. Through her involvement, she learned more about systemic inequality and the unconscious biases she had carried for years. For Michael, the experience deepened his commitment to the cause. Working closely with families like Betty's reminded him why he started First Class Dreams in the first place, not just to address prejudice, but to build bridges between people from different walks of life. Months later, Betty asked Michael if she could share her story publicly. She wanted to own her mistakes and show others that it was never too late to change. Michael agreed, and together they co-wrote an op-ed for a major news outlet. In the piece, Betty described the incident on the plane, her initial defensiveness, and the hard lessons she'd learned since. "I thought I was protecting my space," she wrote, "but what I was really doing was closing my mind. Michael's grace in that moment, and his willingness to help my son, has taught me more about humility and growth than I ever thought possible." The op-ed went viral, sparking another wave of conversations about bias, redemption, and the power of forgiveness. Jacob thrived in the mentorship program, earning a scholarship to a prestigious design school. Betty became an advocate for First Class Dreams, using her voice to encourage others to confront their biases and embrace change. As for Michael, his work with First Class Dreams continued to expand. He spoke at schools, conferences, and corporate events, sharing his story and inspiring others to look beyond their assumptions. Through it all, Michael remained focused on his vision, a world where success wasn't dictated by stereotypes, but by opportunity and potential. The twist of Betty's son being among those helped by First Class Dreams wasn't just poetic justice. It was proof that change could start in the most unexpected places. And for Michael, Betty, and Jacob, it was a reminder that even the smallest moments could become catalysts for something much bigger. A year after the viral incident on the airplane, Michael Anderson stood backstage at a massive auditorium in New York City. The crowd outside buzzed with anticipation. This wasn't just another corporate talk or industry panel. It was a keynote speech at one of the largest conferences on social justice and equality in the country. Michael adjusted his tie, a quiet smile crossing his face. He wasn't here as just a CEO anymore. He was a leader in a movement for change. Over the past year, first-class dreams had grown beyond anyone's expectations. What had started as a scholarship and mentorship initiative for underprivileged youth had blossomed into a national movement. Hundreds of students across the country were now part of the program, receiving opportunities that once seemed out of reach. Michael had expanded the organization's scope, partnering with corporations to create internships and with schools to provide STEM workshops. Communities that had long been overlooked were seeing new investments and opportunities, and Michael's story had become a rallying cry for equity in education and career development. But the impact wasn't just about numbers. It was about stories, like Jacob Stewart's. His transformation from a struggling student to a scholarship recipient and now a first-year student at a prestigious design school was one of many success stories that inspired others to believe in the power of second chances. The airplane incident had thrust Michael into a spotlight he hadn't sought but now embraced. Invitations to speak at universities, conferences, and even government hearings on racial equality flooded his inbox. He had become a voice for change, using his platform not only to highlight systemic bias, but also to push for tangible solutions. Equality isn't just an idea, it's a responsibility, he often said in his speeches. We all have a role to play in dismantling the barriers that hold people back, whether those barriers are visible or not. Michael's calm demeanor and thoughtful approach resonated with audiences across the spectrum. He didn't just call out problems. He offered hope, a vision for how things could be better. It wasn't uncommon for people to approach him after his talks, some in tears, thanking him for putting into words what they had always felt but couldn't express. For Betty Stewart, the past year had been transformative in ways she hadn't imagined. After the op-ed she co-wrote with Michael, she had been inundated with responses, some supportive, others critical. Facing her mistakes publicly was one of the hardest things she had ever done, but it also became the catalyst for her own journey of change. Betty began volunteering with First Class Dreams, not just as a way to support Jacob, but also as a way to give back. Working alongside young people from diverse backgrounds opened her eyes to the systemic inequalities she had once overlooked. She realized that her biases, though subtle, had been part of a much larger problem. Her efforts didn't stop there. Betty joined a local advocacy group focused on anti-racism education and began speaking at community events about her experience. She shared her story honestly, emphasizing the importance of self-reflection and accountability. "I'm not proud of who I was that day on the plane," she said during one event, "but I'm proud of who I've become since. We all have the capacity to change, if we're willing to do the work." The story of Michael and Betty became a touchstone in discussions about racial bias and redemption. Schools used it as a case study in social psychology classes. Corporations referenced it in diversity training programs. The hashtag First Class Dreams, once a viral trend, became a symbol of hope and progress. The ripple effects extended beyond Michael and Betty's immediate circle. Policies in several industries began to shift. Airlines, inspired by the story, implemented mandatory bias training for their staff. Corporate leaders publicly committed to addressing inequities in hiring and promotions. On social media, discussions about microaggressions and systemic bias became more nuanced, with more people willing to confront uncomfortable truths about their own behavior. At one of First Class Dreams' annual galas, Betty was invited to speak as a guest of honor. She stood on stage, her voice steady but emotional, recounting her journey from a woman consumed by silent biases to an active advocate for change. "I used to think that the world was fine as it was," she said. "But Michael showed me that just because something is fine for you doesn't mean it's fine for everyone. Change isn't about guilt. It's about responsibility. And I'm here because I believe we can all take responsibility for making things better." Michael, seated in the audience, felt a swell of pride. Betty's transformation had been one of the most unexpected but rewarding parts of the past year. She wasn't just an ally now, she was a partner in the work. By the time Michael took the stage at the New York conference, the audience's applause was deafening. He began his speech by reflecting on the past year, on the small spark that had ignited a much larger fire. "This journey started with a misunderstanding," he said. "A moment of bias on a plane. But what could have been just another forgettable experience became something bigger because people decided to act. They decided to listen, to reflect, and to do better." He looked out at the audience, his voice rising with conviction. "This isn't about one man, one organization, or one story. It's about all of us. The ripple effect of change starts with a single drop, but together, we can create waves." The audience rose to their feet, cheering as Michael stepped back from the podium. Among them was Betty, clapping the loudest, her face lit with determination. Together, they had proven that even the most unexpected encounters could lead to profound transformation. As the event concluded, Michael and Betty found themselves side by side in the lobby. They shared a quiet smile, a wordless acknowledgement of how far they had come. "This is just the beginning," Michael said, his voice warm with optimism. Betty nodded. "And I'm ready to keep going." The ripple effect of their story was far from over. It had started with a single confrontation, but it had grown into something far greater. A movement fueled by compassion, understanding, and the belief that change was always possible. The sun shone brightly over a newly renovated community center in Chicago, its vibrant mural-covered walls standing as a symbol of renewal and hope. A crowd of excited children, parents, and local leaders gathered outside for the ribbon-cutting ceremony. The building was more than just a physical space. It was the headquarters for a groundbreaking initiative, the culmination of months of collaboration between Michael Anderson and Betty Stewart. Michael stood at the podium, his tailored suit contrasting with the colorful backdrop, yet his warm smile blended seamlessly with the energy of the day. Next to him was Betty, her once reserved demeanor replaced by a quiet confidence. Together, they were about to unveil the fruits of a partnership that neither could have anticipated a year ago. The idea for the community center had come about during one of Betty's volunteer sessions with First Class Dreams. She had noticed that while scholarships and mentorships were invaluable, many families lacked access to basic resources, safe spaces, technology, and workshops that could help kids and parents alike. When she brought the idea to Michael, he didn't hesitate. "This is exactly what First Class Dreams is about," he had said, "creating spaces where potential can thrive." The project had been ambitious, a fully equipped facility offering tutoring, tech training, arts programs, and even wellness classes for families. Funding came from both private donors and grants, bolstered by Michael's corporate connections and Betty's growing network of community advocates. They had worked side by side, navigating challenges with a shared vision. As Michael stepped up to the microphone, the crowd quieted. His voice carried the same passion that had inspired so many over the past year. "This center is proof of what we can accomplish when we work together," he said. "It's a space where every child, regardless of their background, can dream big and achieve even bigger. It's a reminder that change starts with people, ordinary people who decide to act." He turned to Betty, gesturing for her to join him at the podium. She hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward, her hands clasped nervously but her voice steady. "A year ago," she began, "I never could have imagined standing here. I made a mistake rooted in assumptions and biases I didn't even realize I had. But instead of closing the door on me, Michael showed me what grace looks like. He gave me a chance to not just make amends but to grow." The crowd erupted into applause as Betty's voice grew stronger. "This center isn't just about second chances. It's about first chances. It's about making sure everyone has a fair shot at success." With a ceremonial snip of oversized scissors, the ribbon fell away, and the doors to the center opened. Children rushed inside, their laughter filling the air, as Michael and Betty exchanged a glance of quiet triumph. Inside, the community center was buzzing with life. In one room, a group of students gathered around computers in a coding workshop led by First Class Dreams mentors. In another, parents attended a seminar on financial literacy. The walls were adorned with artwork from local children, showcasing their creativity and aspirations. Jacob Stewart was among the crowd, now a confident young man and a proud representative of First Class Dreams. He led a group of younger kids through an art class, sharing the skills he had honed at design school. Watching him, Betty felt an overwhelming sense of pride. not just in her son, but in the journey they had both taken to get here. As the day wound down, Michael and Betty found a quiet moment to reflect. They sat on a bench outside the center, the sounds of children and families drifting out through the open doors. "This is just the beginning," Michael said, echoing words he had spoken months earlier. "There's so much more to do." Betty nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "And I'm ready for it. I've learned so much this past year, not just about others, but about myself. I want to keep paying it forward." Michael looked out at the bustling scene before them, the center glowing under the evening sun. "You know, when I started First Class Dreams, I thought it was about giving back. But it's become so much more. It's about connection, about showing people what's possible when we see each other for who we really are." As they stood, watching the last families leave the center, Michael and Betty felt the weight of their shared journey. It was a journey that had begun with conflict, but had blossomed into something neither could have imagined. "What do you think's next?" Betty asked, her voice curious. Michael smiled. "Whatever it is, we'll figure it out together." The camera of life panned away, capturing the glow of the center and the vibrant energy surrounding it. It wasn't the end of their story, just another chapter in an ongoing narrative of hope, redemption, and the power of change. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the center remained alight, a beacon of what could happen when people dared to dream of a better world and took the steps to make it real. The future wasn't written, but for Michael, Betty, and the lives they had touched, it was full of promise.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.